Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Center for Constitutional Studies, Utah Valley University, and the many staff and executive officials who have put together this event. It is a great honor and a thrill for me to be here. It wasn't very long ago that a U.S. senator and an aspirant for president would joke that the fastest way to empty a room was to shout the word federalism. We haven't shouted the word, but we've mentioned it probably more than 100 times, and I'm just grateful that people are still here and part of this and enjoying it. Federalism is America's endless battle. Every generation is confronted anew with the federalism question. That question is expressed in various ways. One way is, how many communities are we to be? One or many? How are we to balance individual liberties and community needs? Or how should we preference and prioritize democratic representation that emphasizes self-government and diversity but leads to inequality? Or should we favor expertise, equality, and uniformity? Federalism's future, I think, will be determined to a considerable extent by how we answer these questions. Why do I think these questions are so important to focus on and not other seemingly more pressing issues like the federal debt, which the CBO recently announced would exceed GDP within a decade? Or issues like the judiciary, which seems to be increasingly conservative and may push the nation towards a more tight federalism orientation? Or state capacity. The states are more able now than at any time in the past to take on responsibilities and to resist the federal government. As important as these things are, and as significant as they could be in influencing federalism's future, I think the questions, how many nations are we to, how many communities are we to be, is where a significant amount of focus should be. And the reason is because I think this captures what's called the federal spirit. And many of the significant federalism scholars that I look to have completed their careers emphasizing the federal spirit. The need to understand and look at the federal spirit and how it guides and directs our communities today. The federal spirit To understand this, we have to understand that federalism is, in many ways, a sociological construct. That is, the political institutions and structures that we have are, in many ways, a reflection of the compromise that Americans make when they agreed to federalism. Federalism, at its basis, is valuing the desire to be both united and separate. United on some things and separate on other things. And it's wanting to retain that balance, wanting to retain both of those elements that is what preserves federalism and what guides and directs how we understand and how we animate our institutions and our structures. So we might ask for a second, what is the health of America's federal spirit? And there's some interesting ways to look at this. We have significant differences within America, significant divisions, all right, polarization. And we might look at that and say, well, that's the separateness. But the problem with polarization in many of these divisions that we have is that we don't appreciate that separateness. We don't appreciate the difference that that creates. Instead, we want to take over the other side, right? We either want to destroy them or we want to convert them to our side. And it's not appreciating that difference and that distinctness. It's trying, instead, going against the federal spirit and trying to create uniformity. And that's contrary to what that federal spirit's trying to create. The indications are that in many ways, the separateness that used to really make America federal, the things that distinguished your allegiance to a state, are failing, are disappearing. Americans are identifying themselves more and more as Americans. There's a book that's recently come out, The Increasingly United States of America, where the author is making this argument. And there are a number of different authors from the last couple of decades who have been saying that the distinctness, that division, that separateness of what the federal system was based on is disappearing. If that's disappearing, why do we want federalism? Why, if we're uniform and we identify solely as Americans, why don't we move in that direction? And yet, I would say a lot of these ideas, this push towards centralization, is based on what I call federalism fallacies. There are a number of narratives that we have repeated from the founding, but especially in the last century, that have pushed us towards centralization, that have pushed us to put more power in the federal government or to consolidate governments and to minimize the local and smaller governments. And so that's what I want to focus on today, is these federalism fallacies, and suggest that there's actually a reason to still appreciate that federal principle, to have unity and yet separateness. The first fallacy I want to talk about is Riker's fallacy. So William Riker wrote in 1964 that support for federalism is support for racism. This is still taught today in our college campuses. And yet we're beginning to see this breaking down. People are beginning to realize that that's no longer true. Now in 2018, we have some different things coming out. We're realizing that the federal government is also capable of tyranny and abuse of power and racism. Right? We're also learning that it's okay for state and local governments to defy the federal government. What a number of states are doing, California, in resisting the federal government on illegal immigration, is what Arizona was doing a few years ago, and the nation was saying, you can't do that, you're a state, you should let the federal government make these decisions. So there's been a position reversal there. To be progressive today is to support federalism. So support for federalism is based on many things, including opposition to racism. And indeed, one of the leading thinkers, Heather Gerken, the dean of the Yale Law School, is making an argument that the best way to help minorities is federalism, all the way down. The next fallacy I want to talk about is the race to the bottom. The race to the bottom is the idea that you're going to have different governments competing with each other, and one of them is going to realize at one point in time that it can cut its taxes or its environmental standards or labor standards and get a big benefit because businesses are going to move into that state. And you have these businesses moving in, and they leave other states. Other states don't have the tax revenue anymore, and so they have to cut their standards. And so you get this spiraling cutting down to the least common denominator or to the bottom. It's a very powerful concept. Between 2012 and 2017, this was used 6,807 times in U.S. wire feeds. The decision that was mentioned earlier, Murphy versus NCAA, when that came out, Senator Orrin Hatch said, this is going to create a race to the bottom and we need to do something about it. So it's quite a powerful rhetorical concept that's used continuously, and we have this idea that it's true. Is it true? Well, there have been 3 meta-analyses that have been conducted since the beginning of the 20th century, 2001, 2008, and 2018. All of them came to similar conclusions. The first thing is that race to the bottom is rare and weak. It's not nearly as common as often indicated. And the one study, I did the 2018 study, the one study I found where there was a race to the bottom that we could clearly say was a race to the bottom actually was a result of government failure, not because of government competition. The second finding that the studies agreed on is that most interjurisdictional or intergovernmental competition leads to real and large benefits. We call this a race to the top. That actual competition actually helps governments to be better, improve their efficiency, their effectiveness, and they also diversify significantly, creating more opportunities for Ilya Somon's foot voting. The third conclusion is that race to the bottom is a rhetorically powerful concept exploited by politicians and elites. Now, I need to qualify something here. You will find scholars who claim that they have found race to the bottom. There are quite a few studies on this, and yet what they've done is they have diluted the definition of race to the bottom. Rather than finding an actual race to the least common denominator or the bottom, what they have found is a decrease of some sort. Usually it's the top end of programs are being reduced a little bit, but you also see the bottom ones coming up. So there seems to be a convergence around the middle, and yet there's still a diversification of what happens within that. Or, as once happened in Australia, they cut one tax, but they find other ways to provide workmen's tax compensation. They find other ways to help workers to benefit them. So there are professors who are claiming that it's happening, but it's a diluted definition where we actually look at race to the bottom as the concept is understood. We don't see it happening. So interjurisdictional competition is not the problem that we thought it was. It actually is a great benefit. Another federalism fallacy is the political safeguards of federalism fallacies. Now, this is the idea that the Supreme Court endorsed after Garcia versus San Antonio in 1985, in which they said, we don't need to make these decisions anymore. It's been tough, trying to find that boundary between state and national governments. We're going to turn it over to the political process. And there's ample opportunities and protection safeguards within the political process for the states to defend themselves. One of the claims was that the state governments would get together, they would work together and oppose a tyrannical, usurpative federal government. And that actually comes from the Federalist Papers, the foundings of the ways that we thought that Hamilton and Madison helped us to think about this. But this is a classic collective action problem. The states don't actually get together that often. The last time they really did it strongly was the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, where they had a collective reason to get together, but oftentimes states benefit from the federal government being more active and more engaged. And what happens is, rather than the states all coming together, it's usually the most powerful states, the states that have a congressperson that's well placed to influence the legislation. They know that they've got a powerful person, and so they use that person to get what they want, rather than to work with the states collectively to protect state interest. Just recently, the Affordable Care Act, right? The Republicans had promised that they would kill it. It didn't. They weren't able to, and part of the reason was because Republican governors in a few states benefited from the Affordable Care Act, and they communicated with their legislators, we don't want this dead. And so the Republicans weren't able to build enough support in order to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So there's a collective action with the state legislators, or the state governments, not getting together to make it happen. The second policy that's often argued is that the state representatives who get elected to the federal government are going to actually be more engaged in protecting state interest, right? They've had experience in state, they've seen the federal government telling them what to do, they're going to resist. And there have been a number of studies that looked at this. I looked at it a number of years ago, and a colleague of mine just picked it up recently. We were at a couple conferences together, she was presenting, and I was like, what'd you find? I didn't find any evidence of it. And I'm like, thank you, I didn't find any evidence either. And we can't publish it, because these sorts of things aren't, when you have negative results, it's oftentimes not publishable. So, and I remember talking to Jim Martin, who some of you might know. He was a long time icon at the National Governors Association about this. And he said, oh yeah, they're good for about 2 or 3 years. And then after that, they forget where they came from, and they're actually the worst ones. They're like, I know what's going on in the states, and I don't believe what you're saying, and so they end up being almost more nationalistic than the state legislators. A third one, the political parties are state-based, they're decentralized, they favor state governments. Yeah, that was true at one time, but that's no longer true. There's still a division there. Campaign finance reform actually creates a bigger division, but that prevents the local politicians, state and local politicians, from communicating with the state officials, being on the campaign trail together, so they don't have that sort of interaction. But really, most of the political party dominance comes from the top down. The state parties don't have a lot of say in that, despite the fact that they once did. Federalism is too important to leave just to the states because of the collective action problem. I can't claim credit for that line. That's from somebody else, but I think it was an Arizona legislator who said that. All right, the last fallacy I want to talk about is the idea that elites and experts know best. Now, I'm not a hypocrite, right? Being here as an expert, I'm not saying that all experts are bad, but I am saying that to a certain extent, I think we have oversold and overpromised what elites can do, right? And this is part of the centralization idea that let's get the experts collected together at the federal level. And we see this argument actually in Federalist Paper number 3, number 10, number 17, number 27, and I could go on and on with a number of others. There's a couple of problems with this. The first problem is democracy's paradox of authority. That is, as we make authorities and we give them more power, we diminish democracy. We let the authorities make the decisions, and the democracy can no longer participate and shape that. And so this is a significant problem within the system. It's built into sovereignty. Hobbes said that the people must surrender their judgment, right? We want an alienation of the public. The problem with this is that when we give in too much to authorities and we don't allow that discourse to happen, we find an atrophy of the institutions of popular control. This harms the institutions. This harms expertise. Another problem with this is an exaggerated faith in intelligence. Now, I take that line from David Brooks in one of his columns in the New York Times. But in many ways, we have placed way too much faith in intelligence to solve our political problems. Philip Tetlock wrote a famous book called Expert Political Judgment, in which he found that pundits are more often wrong than they are right. And now there's a big reason for that. It's not just experts, it's who the media chooses as its experts. But expertise is really hard when you have a complex environment with long-term outcomes and not clear feedback mechanisms. Doctors, firemen, they get a quicker feedback, they learn faster, they develop that instantaneous sense of what's going on. But it's much harder to do in social sciences and at these more in politics. Experts, Philip Tetlock found, beat randomness, but just barely. And the group that's worse than random, Stanford undergraduates. Another problem with experts is information, the nature of information. Information is local and sticky. It stays where it's produced. It doesn't rise up hierarchies very well. If you've played the telegraph game and whispered in somebody's ear and let it go around, by the end it's totally different, right? It's the same thing with information in our societies. It's very hard for information to move up that hierarchy. We do have the federalism system. We want uniformity. We want experts at the national level because that's sometimes where the information is produced and they have it and they can make better choices. But oftentimes there's information that's produced at the local level and the experts, the parents, the citizens, the others have a better sense sometimes of what's going on, and they at least need to have an influence and a say in shaping what develops. Another problem with this is the nature of science is it's really good at saying no, right? We can prove hypotheses wrong. It's harder to say yes, to say clearly this is what will happen, right? That's kind of the problem with why all of us are a bit hesitant to predict what the future is going to be. But science can tell us really good no. It's harder to say yes. Another problem that I want to talk about is a misunderstood understanding of the basis of system creation and flourishing. There's a new science that's developing. It's called complexity science. In social science, it's called complex adaptive systems. And it's contrary to much of what we think from our traditional scientific understanding. The traditional scientific understanding thinks of order as being imposed. We can create order. We can establish it. And that's kind of a top-down system. In complex adaptive systems, there is simple rules, interfacing going on that leads to spontaneous order. It leads to emergence. One of the most important ideas in the last 100 years is the idea that you can get something out of that's totally different than the parts that go into it. And so the idea is that with a few simple rules, as long as the people engage and follow those rules, you can get complex, spontaneous order. That's the Constitution. Few simple rules, one of the shortest constitutions in the world. It lays out the institutions, it lays out a few rules, and then it says, go do it. and you get this incredible spontaneous order. Experts and elites, I say, have overpromised, and this has harmed the institutions and elites. We need elites, we need the institutions, but we also need a healthier understanding of how to use them. So I think for federalism's future, I think there are opportunities to change the fair weather federalism system that we have now, a number of things that are coming along the lines, but I think one of the things that we really need to think about is the federal spirit. We need to help people understand better the need to have both unity and separateness, the need to answer the questions, how many communities are we to be, one or many? The federalism answer is many, and we need to be able to create the narrative better to explain that. How do we balance individual liberty and community needs? Federalism offers a suggestion for how we can reach that. Do we wish to favor liberty and diversity or equality and uniformity? This is a big question. This is a challenge of our time that it's going to take a conversation to answer that question and decide whether we want to preserve the federal spirit and the federal balance that we have. Thank you.